I had always considered my life stable. My marriage to James was a familiar routine, not perfect, but comfortable. We had moved to the suburbs of Seattle together, thinking it was time for a fresh start, though nothing in our new life truly felt new. It was quiet, peaceful, and perhaps a bit dull. But that evening, everything changed. We were heading to a gathering with his colleagues in a neighboring town. It seemed like any other event, an obligatory social affair, until I met Taylor. I had heard James speak of him before, a friend from college, someone he often mentioned in passing, but never someone I'd actually met. I didn't expect much. After all, James was a great talker, and I'd often heard about his past, his old friendships, but Taylor was different. He stood out in a way that caught my attention immediately. He wasn't the type to blend in. With his easy smile and sharp wit, he dominated the conversation effortlessly. There was something about the way he spoke, something magnetic that made the others in the room fade into the background. I watched him as he moved through the crowd, his voice light and confident. I didn't know it then, but that night would mark the beginning of something I wasn't prepared for. As the evening went on, Taylor and I started talking. It began innocuously, just casual conversation about the event, the weather, the usual small talk. But soon, something shifted. There was an ease to our conversation, an unspoken understanding that had me feeling more alive than I had in months. James was busy chatting with his colleagues, as he usually did, but I couldn't stop myself from getting lost in Taylor's presence. He had this way of making everything feel interesting, important even. When the evening came to a close, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, not with James, who was as affectionate as ever, but with myself. It wasn't just the conversation with Taylor, it was how he had made me feel seen in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Something stirred inside of me, and for the first time in a long while, I was conscious of a quiet longing, a curiosity about what more life had to offer. Little did I know, that fleeting moment of connection would pull me into a whirlwind I was unprepared to navigate. The dinner that night lingered in my mind far longer than I ever expected. I couldn't shake the memory of Taylor's voice, his laugh, the way he looked at me as though he genuinely cared about my thoughts, as if I mattered beyond being James's wife. For the first time in years, I questioned everything about my life, my marriage, my choices, the quiet, suffocating comfort I had settled into. Days passed, and I tried to push it all aside. James was as loving as ever, making plans for our weekend outings and talking about our future together. But something felt off. The dinners we shared were pleasant, but they lacked the spark they once had. Conversations that used to come easily now felt forced. The silence between us stretched longer than it ever should. It was as though I was standing on the edge of something, looking down, but unsure if I should jump. Then, one afternoon, I found myself thinking about Taylor again. I thought about the way his eyes locked onto mine during that dinner, how we had shared small moments, little glances, brief smiles that felt charged with something more than simple politeness. Was it just my imagination? Or was there an unspoken connection between us that I couldn't ignore? I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that it was just a fleeting spark, a result of being in a new social environment with a stranger. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. Taylor had awakened something inside of me. I wasn't sure what it was yet, but the curiosity about him gnawed at me. His humor, his effortless charm, his ability to make me feel interesting again, it all felt so intoxicating. As I sat at home, lost in these thoughts, James came into the room, asking if I was okay. The concern in his voice was genuine, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him what was really going on in my mind. Instead, I forced a smile, brushed it off, and nodded. But inside, the conflict was growing, relentless. I was tethered to my life with James, yet something about Taylor's presence had pulled me into a new world I wasn't sure I was ready to face. That evening, as I lay in bed beside James, sleep seemed a distant thought. I kept replaying every conversation I'd had with Taylor, wondering if he felt the same way. if he had sensed that spark too. I was caught in a whirlwind of uncertainty, unsure of what it all meant but too scared to let it go. How could I even begin to understand what I was feeling? The more I thought about Taylor, the more I realized how much I had been neglecting myself in my relationship with James. It wasn't that James didn't love me, or that he was a bad husband. He was wonderful in many ways, but there was a quietness to our life together that had made me forget who I was before I became his wife. And now, with Taylor, I was remembering pieces of myself that I hadn't even realized were missing. I didn't know where this new, confusing path would lead, but I could feel it calling to me, pulling me in, and I wasn't sure how long I could resist. A week later, James suggested we spend the weekend away in Oregon. A beach getaway sounded perfect to him, an opportunity to unwind and disconnect from the busy pace of his work. But as the days passed, I could sense he wasn't as enthusiastic about the trip as he let on. He was distracted, lost in his thoughts about upcoming meetings, and I saw the same familiar distance between us. I wasn't surprised, but I was disappointed. I had hoped this weekend would offer us a chance to reconnect, but I wasn't sure we even knew how to anymore. The idea of spending the weekend alone with James didn't excite me as it used to, so I took a different route. I told him I'd go alone. He was too busy to join, and I needed a break from the routine. But instead of retreating in solitude, I invited Taylor to come along. At first, I hesitated. Was this a mistake? Should I really go away with him, just the two of us? But I didn't feel the same kind of hesitation I would have expected. I wanted to see more of Taylor, to spend time with him, and understand what it was about him that had made such an impact on me. In a strange way, I knew that my life, and perhaps even the choices I would make, were about to shift. The drive to the beach was filled with an awkward silence. We didn't know each other well enough yet for it to feel entirely comfortable. Taylor and I exchanged light conversation, but I could feel the tension, an unspoken awareness of something we hadn't yet named. But as we arrived, the beauty of the coast washed over me, and I let the sound of the waves quiet my thoughts. We spent the first few hours walking along the shore. The sand stretched endlessly, and there was a strange peace in the emptiness. For the first time in ages, I felt free. No obligations, no expectations. The chaos of my life back home seemed miles away. We didn't talk much at first. The sound of the waves crashing against the rocks filled the space between us, but it was a comfortable silence, one that didn't feel strained. Eventually, Taylor started to talk. He spoke about his childhood, his past, and his fears. I found myself opening up in return, sharing things with him that I hadn't spoken about in years. The conversation flowed effortlessly, like we had known each other forever. The beach felt like a sanctuary, a place where we could say things we couldn't say anywhere else. There was a connection forming, an intimacy I wasn't prepared for but couldn't ignore. As the sun began to set, the sky painted with hues of orange and pink, we sat down on a large rock, watching the waves crash below us. Taylor turned to me, his eyes more serious than I had ever seen them. For a moment, there was a silence between us that felt charged. He looked at me as though he were seeing something inside me, something deeper. "You know," he said softly, "you don't have to keep pretending you're okay with everything. You deserve more than just what you're settling for." His words hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't realized how much I had been holding inside, how much I had been suppressing to avoid facing the truth of my own unhappiness. And here was Taylor, someone I barely knew, cutting straight through the facade I had built around myself. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I looked out at the vast ocean in front of me, trying to collect my thoughts. I hadn't come here to confront my feelings, but now that they were on the table, I couldn't ignore them. "I don't know what I'm doing," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what any of this means." Taylor reached out, his hand brushing mine. It was a simple gesture, but it sent a ripple of heat through my body. His touch was comforting and unnerving at the same time. It's okay not to know. Sometimes it takes feeling lost to find what really matters. For the rest of the evening, we stayed there on the beach, watching the stars appear in the sky, each of us wrapped up in our thoughts. I couldn't tell if I was walking closer to something dangerous or if I was simply finding myself in a place I didn't know existed. By the time we left the beach and went to a small cafe in town, I was no longer sure of anything. I was only certain of one thing. Something had changed inside me, and I wasn't sure I could go back to the way things were. When I came back from Oregon, everything felt different. James was warm, attentive, as always, but I could no longer ignore the distance growing between us. The dinners that once felt like moments of connection now felt like routine, dull, and lacking meaning. I tried to bury my feelings, but they surged to the surface whenever I looked at him. One evening, while walking through the park, I ran into Taylor. We stopped, and the conversation began easily, just like before. But this time, there was something more. A weight to the words, a charge in the air. His eyes held me, and for the first time in ages, I didn't feel like I was pretending. I didn't want to pretend anymore. The look we shared said everything, more than I was willing to admit. I realized then that I couldn't turn back. My heart was already too far gone. A few days later, Taylor invited me to a concert in the city. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but something about it felt inevitable. I agreed without hesitation, as if there was no turning back from the pull between us. When we sat down in the crowd, our shoulders brushed, and my pulse quickened. Every little movement, every glance felt amplified, like the world was narrowing down to just the two of us. His hand brushed mine once more, and this time, it lingered. A spark. I could feel it, deep inside me, a stirring that I hadn't felt in years. But the moment passed, and the weight of reality crept back in. I tried to shake it off. I wasn't ready to make a choice. I still loved James, didn't I? But the question lingered, unanswered. By the end of the night, I knew I couldn't keep ignoring the shift inside me, but I wasn't ready to act on it, not yet. The fear of what would happen if I did was paralyzing. So I left the concert with a heavy heart, my mind torn between two lives, neither of which I could fully embrace. The days that followed felt like a slow unraveling. I returned home to James, who seemed so unaware of the quiet storm that was brewing inside me. His attempts to talk about our future were met with a hollow smile from me, as though I were already elsewhere. I couldn't look him in the eye without seeing the truth of how disconnected we had become. I was no longer the woman he thought he knew, and I didn't know how to tell him that. The distance between us grew, and I hated myself for it. Every night when he reached for me, I froze, my mind elsewhere. I thought of Taylor, his touch, his laughter, the way he made me feel more alive than I'd felt in years. It felt wrong, but I couldn't stop myself. I told myself I wasn't cheating, not yet, but every secret moment with Taylor, every stolen kiss, felt like a betrayal. One night, as I walked through the park again to clear my head, I saw Taylor. It wasn't planned, but it felt like fate. We talked, our words messy and rushed, as if we both knew there was no turning back now. I wasn't ready to face the consequences of my feelings, but deep down, I knew they were already too far gone. The confrontation with myself was brutal. I was caught between two worlds, one where I had built a life with James, and one where everything was uncertain but free. I couldn't reconcile the two. The fear of losing everything held me in place, but every moment of avoidance made me feel more desperate, more distant from the life I had once known. I wasn't sure how long I could keep pretending. Taylor and I continued meeting in the quiet hours, hidden away from James's gaze. Each time felt like a brief escape, a chance to breathe freely without the weight of the life I had built with my husband. Every touch, every shared laugh, even the smallest moments, made me feel something I hadn't felt in years, alive, unrestrained, real. But with each stolen moment, the guilt gnawed at me. I could no longer ignore it. I was torn between the two men, each of them representing different parts of me, different versions of my life. James was kind, steady, familiar, but now he felt like a stranger in his own home. Taylor, on the other hand, represented possibility, excitement, and a truth I hadn't been brave enough to face until now. Yet each time I returned to James, each time I played the role of the loving wife, A piece of me felt like it was dying. The lies, the half-truths, they weighed on me more than I could bear. I knew something had to change, but I couldn't bring myself to make that choice. One evening, when James was out for work, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, thinking about everything. About what was real and what I had built on illusion. I could see myself staying in the life I had, continuing to pretend, but I knew deep down that I would never be the same again. I would always be haunted by the moments with Taylor, by the feeling that I was living someone else's life. I wanted to talk to James, to tell him everything, but the fear was overwhelming. What if I destroyed everything? What if I couldn't take back the hurt I was about to cause? I didn't have the answers, and every attempt to find them only made things worse. So I kept waiting, hoping that the decision would somehow make itself. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. It wasn't until I couldn't bear the weight of my silence any longer that everything came to a head. I had spent days wrestling with the choices before me, trying to hold on to something that no longer felt real. I couldn't continue living a lie, hiding behind the facade of a marriage that no longer fit who I had become. So I wrote a letter to James. It was painful. Every word felt like it was ripping something from me, but it was the only way I knew how to start the conversation that had to happen. I explained everything, the connection with Taylor, the growing distance between us, my confusion, and my realization that I couldn't continue down this path without confronting the truth. The moment I hit send, I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. It was done. There was no going back now. When James read the letter, he didn't cry. He didn't shout. He just looked at me, his eyes vacant, as if he were seeing a stranger for the first time. His silence crushed me. In that moment, I realized that the man I had once known was also lost, just as I had been. The absence of his reaction, his anger, his disappointment, anything, left me with a hollow emptiness. He didn't ask for answers, and maybe he already knew. It was as if he had been waiting for me to say it aloud. His eyes were distant, the hurt unspoken, but palpable. "I don't know how to fix this," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. "But I don't want you to regret this. Whatever you decide, you have to know that." It wasn't what I wanted to hear, but in some ways, it was what I needed. For the first time, I saw James not as my husband, but as another person, another soul who had his own path to walk, one that no longer intersected with mine. I stood there, watching him, my heart aching in ways I couldn't even begin to explain. There was no way to undo the past, no way to go back to the way things were. I didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time, I knew I had to move forward, even if it meant facing the unknown. The weight of it all, the guilt, the fear, the uncertainty, still hung over me, but I couldn't let it paralyze me anymore. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I knew that this moment, this decision, would change everything. Whether it was for better or worse, I couldn't yet say. But I was ready to take that first step into whatever came next, even if it meant walking alone. The morning after everything unraveled, the house felt different. It wasn't home anymore. It was just a space filled with echoes of the past. James had left early without a word, and the silence was deafening. I knew I had hurt him, broken something that might never be repaired, but I also knew I couldn't stay in a life that felt like a slow suffocation. Taylor hadn't reached out since our last meeting, and I wasn't sure if I wanted him to. This had never been just about him. It was about me, about facing the truth I had been avoiding for so long. I had spent years convincing myself that stability was the same as happiness, that comfort was enough. But now, stripped of all my illusions, I saw myself for what I really was, lost, unsure, but finally honest. By midday, I packed a small bag. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to leave. The idea of staying in that house, surrounded by memories of what once was, felt unbearable. I needed space. I needed to breathe. As I stepped outside, the crisp air wrapped around me, sharp and cold, yet strangely invigorating. I stood there for a moment, staring at the road ahead, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on me. I had no plan, no clear direction, only the knowledge that the life I had known was now behind me, and so I took my first step forward. Alone,